All right, then. Welcome to the Cyber Insurance News and Information Podcast. I'm the executive editor and host of Cyber Insurance News Podcast, Martin Hinton. Joining me today is Lee Nolan, the general manager for the UK and Ireland for Hitachi Vantara. And they're a company that helps big business manage data, which, as anyone listening to this knows, involves a lot of security, a lot of cyber. So, Lee, first of all, thanks very much for joining us today. How's your day been so far?
Yeah, good. Very good. Thank you. I'm excited by this interview, so looking forward to it.
Excellent. Now, you've not been at Hitachi terribly long. 6 months is what I think. Is that correct?
Correct. Just over 6 months. So it's been a bit of a whirlwind, but it's been exciting nevertheless.
And your career to this path tracks a pretty interesting path. I wonder if you could take me through a bit of the stuff you've done that involves enterprise technology and infrastructure and managed services and that sort of thing.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Goodness. So this is going to make me feel incredibly old. So 1998, I started at Computer Center, who are blazing a trail across the US and Europe and elsewhere at the moment. So yeah, and they were certainly in the embryonic stages of sorts to drive managed services. I was there nearly 10 years. Moved into a startup organization, so Pillar Data Systems, which was Larry Ellison's VC through Taco Ventures, which was great. And then had a stint at NetApp and then into Insight Solutions, who again is a worldwide reseller and solutions provider, which was fantastic. Then had into a private equity organization, which had an exit into Ricoh. And then beyond then went back to NetApp, which was fantastic. And then into Pure for a very short period of time before Hitachi Vantara came calling and pulled me in as general manager for the UK. So certainly in the UK channel, a fairly wide experience there, but also in the storage industry from an IT perspective, amongst some of our competition who are now, and then now exciting and looking forward to the time that I'm going to have at Hitachi Vantara.
So you've got the background in security, cybersecurity, and infrastructure. I wonder whether that dual perspective, how do you think that helps you see cyber risk and the sort of state of that reality for companies now?
Yeah, it helped enormously. So if I roll back to Computer Center, there was a lot of client side managed services rather than data center managed services. I know across the board at the moment, that's where their offering is, but it was a lot of client side. So understanding individual users, behavior, programs to roll out. So that's certainly the most prevalent attack surface. But then also moving in from a storage perspective and backups. Clearly, those are the areas that get attacked before generally people are aware that there's an issue. Working in the PE organization, which was a company called MTI, focusing enormously around cybersecurity, working with both public sector organizations and private sector, it gave me the opportunity to understand in a lot more detail around how cyber resilience was being deployed and how agents were looking to attack certain organizations and the reasoning and how it works. So I've got a good view, and also things around how managed services and cyber managed services have evolved over time. 24/7 eyes on glass, it's nowhere near quick enough, moving through multiple false positives and how you can filter through just the logs and the notifications, getting into an environment that is automated, that does become a labyrinth for attackers. But really, the market at the moment will always look to defend as best they can, but everyone realizes at some point there will be a breach. And it's ensuring that you have a clear and well-trained process to recover your organization. And so that broad spread of different understanding of different attack services, the technologies that are behind it, how they've evolved over many decades now, and definitely feeling old, has really helped. And it helps and take a common sense view of a lot of these environments that, the cybersecurity market is enormously disparate. There's so many different organizations spinning up. And I think just having that very straightforward view about and clarity about how you're looking to defend and how you're looking to recover is so important, because you become highly effective then in the deployment of any plans, or any defensive mechanisms that you're looking to deploy as well.
So you've used the word ensure, defensive mechanisms, recovery, and that pivots us to one of the topics we discussed as we prepared for this is the idea that cyber insurance covers some things, doesn't cover others. And with regard to recovery costs, I wonder whether you might sort of parse out some of the things that you've experienced, the things you've seen go left or right or sideways or up or down with regard to coverage and what happens when, as you touched on just now, the inevitable occurs and that breach happens. The if, the not if, but when reality of this and the cyber insurance role in all that.
Yeah, and I think this is normally where the presentations start, Martin, which is, this is how much it costs and it could happen to you. I think it's so well publicized. Those organizations, JLR, M&S, Co-op, they're all in a position, and people can genuinely see the hundreds of millions of dollars that they've been impacted by. It wiped out profitability for a year for M&S. And so getting ourselves in a position when we're talking about insurance, what does that mean? What does that look like? And I know from our previous conversation, it really does roll back to business continuity. Where is your planning? How are you organizing your business to be able to function when that happens? What are the steps you are going to take? With regards to cost, that's really down to your own organization. The assessment of the ransomware is never anywhere near as much. And I think there was one that said it's the cost to your business is circa 24 times more than the ransomware itself. Right. So under that basis, you look at it and say, well, we need to be in a position where we protect our organization and we will recover based on a multitude of different scenarios. The cost assessment has to be there, because there's always how we balancing risk to our organization, ongoing brand that's affected, and what does that look like with regards to customers potentially that we may lose, because these are all impacts that occur when a breach happens inside your organization. And how do we manage our PR? How do we manage what we've done and how we're resolving ourselves? With regards to coverage, you also mentioned what's covered, right, in insurance. Really is down to the provider, right? And I don't provide cyber protection, cyber resiliency, cyber recovery insurance per se, right? I'm not in the insurance industry. But what I do know with the organizations I've worked with, it just depends on what you're looking at. Some organizations will protect you when it comes to assisting for recovery, what's happened. That could be down to funding forensics audit, where you're trying to understand what's happened, how far it's gone within your organization. And others will go right the way through to brand protection, PR organizations being spun up to look after you during that period of time, dealing with the media, because these are, depending on your organization, what type of business you're in, they can be enormously impactful from a brand point of view that I mentioned earlier. So coverage is a big one. And I think having that specialist assistance as well, they will often provide assistance, audits with regards to your environment, methodologies that you're looking to follow. So there's it's such a broad market, and it is quite complex, and the detail is really important.
You used a great analogy related to car insurance to help simplify this because you touch on a reality. It is very complicated, and it isn't something that even some of the more sophisticated companies are particularly familiar with.
Yeah,
The car analogy was if your car insurance repairs the tire or the fender, but while the car's in the shop, you don't have a courtesy vehicle covered by your insurance, so you
exactly.
can't get to work. That's a very simple way. If we take business continuity and just put it in terms of living life continuity, that is the sort of gap that you see quite regularly with cyber insurance, where the 24x part of the ransomware is not covered to the extent that a company thought or they would like. And then these other sort of, I wouldn't say surprise costs, but they come along in the long tail in the form of litigation, and PR is very complicated depending on who you're messaging to, and it's very expensive. I say as an expert in the field. Uh, you used a phrase as a company to look at this situation and to to analyze where your resiliency stands on, say, maybe a scale of 1 to 10, and the phrase you used was minimum viable business. And
Yeah.
I take that to mean, should you suffer an attack, any kind of attack, let's take it out of these abstract cyber worlds, your factory burns down, or, there's a disease that stops everyone from coming to work, for example. None of that sounds crazy anymore. What do you think what do you actually mean? And how do you practice that? How do you parse that out? And when you're looking at these situations, how do you figure out what's important and what you really need, what becomes absolutely necessary, um, for during and post a breach?
Yeah. Look, minimum viable business is critical because it prioritizes your speed of recovery. Which systems and how fast really do you need to get them back up and running? There's um, environments today are so interconnected, right? And so one relies on another, and it's a huge domino effect often, and incredibly difficult to map. Um, Minimum viable business, and it can mean different things to different organizations. But in super simple terms, it's really about what do we need to trade? Income is your lifeblood. And so you need to be able to service your customers to be able to maintain your income as an organization, which then allows you to function as a business. Which systems are an absolute necessity to deliver some of the fundamentals that you need as an organization? This is a board level conversation. What do we need to function as a business? It really isn't bells and whistles. It's just the bare minimum to be able to operate. And you'll isolate down a core set of systems. And you will need to ensure that you have a very clear recovery plan against each of those systems with speed, where they're interconnected, to make sure that your organization can run. That's a minimum. Now, generally, I think the average now is about 7 months for an organization to fully recover and ensure that the systems are you're in a better protected state than you were before, at least, right? So you're looking at 7 months. Average is 21 to 24 days to get your systems back up and running in an environment that means you can trade of sorts as normal. That's still too long. If you were to say to any organization today, right, you're not going to trade for 3 weeks, everything stops. It's paralysis. It's such a difficult situation to be in. Finance teams would just kind of look at this and go, hey, how are we going to operate? Let alone the customers you lose, how do we function financially? And depending on your type of organization, that's a real problem. If I take JLR as an example, the impact to them and their supply chain, for argument's sake, um, is almost immediate, because they need their stock straight off, for their conveyors to keep moving, for the production lines to keep moving. They need that stock available, and it's delivered just in time. That's the idea that's the idea behind the phrase. And so it's not only the organization, this has a wider impact on supply chain, right? So the organizations supplying JLR have been impacted massively. So again, it's understanding, right, how do we function as an organization if we have this enormous reliance on one single business to be able to deliver what we're doing? So there is a wider impact, in an economic supply chain beyond just one single company when these incidents occur. And I think that in itself is a topic that, so I think the likes of JLR has really allowed people to focus on, as well as the supermarkets like Co-op and M&S.
I think it was in the last year, Hitachi Vantara had an incident, without
We
giving
did.
away any sensitive details. What can you tell me about how? Listen, one of the things we know is that, as painful as it is, when bad things happen, it's typically that the pressure in that moment and the stress of that moment that really clarifies the learning curve. And you learn a lot when, whether it's a mistake or a bad actor or whatever it might be.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering what you can tell me about that experience and what you took away with regard to it.
Yeah, look, I think it's well publicized. It impacted the organization. It was the early half of last year, and I wasn't here, but it was certainly publicized. And, it did impact the business for 2 or 3 weeks, was, some significant impact. But the business got back with its core systems very quickly by employing the recovery processes that we talk to our customers about. And so, as an organization, whilst you're always at some point you're going to get hit, it's how quickly you can manage your customers, how you can work with them, allow them to understand, have very clear communication. And of course, in parallel, recovering your systems, identifying where there is a breach, ensuring that's isolated. And that was very quickly identified and isolated, and then bringing systems back up in a clean way. And Hitachi Vantara, because I've spoken to our CISO about this, who we actually use to present to our customers and other organizations that we're engaged with about what happens. Um, our customers constantly feed back to us and say, our relationship with you as Hitachi Vantara is so much stronger because of your communication. We kept everyone updated. We allowed them to understand what was going on. They also work with us because they learn what we did. How did you do it? How did you manage it? So, from very personal experience inside of Hitachi, we understand what it means, what impact it has. And so with some of the lessons learned that we have from that about how we could be better, there's always ways that you can improve. Um, and we are proud of how we manage that. We know it's going to happen to everybody at some point, one time or another. But how do you get the organization working so we continue to function? And we have done that. We got back to a working organization very quickly. And we've just finished our financial year, in which that cyber breach was in. So we're very proud of the results we achieved.
You touched on something that is a little outside what we discussed prior to this, but it's really interesting. And what you describe is the communication level of it. And I've read more than a couple of reports about the prospective CISOs benefit from or believe they would benefit from. And one of them is to be able to talk to other CISOs at other companies, which in a competitive business environment is maybe not traditional, should we say? But that idea of sharing information about what they're seeing, how they reacted, what went right, what went wrong, and also the level of communication about, and I mean, the word I like is transparency with customers or clients and that sort of thing. I wonder whether, that you might have something to add about that being slightly counterintuitive, but because we're facing, in the case of cyber risk and cyber crime, and an almost relatively new problem in the landscape. And the phrase I've heard used by consultants is it's one that requires adaptive change, as in yesterday's solutions won't solve today's and the problems coming in the future. And in the interest of being a business leader, I wonder whether you have any thoughts about that from a managerial point of view. That this is something that requires a little more, is collectivism too much of a word? But that idea that CISOs, again, at competing companies normally share secrets, and I'm not suggesting that's what's happening, but that idea of communication and telling war stories even about how you dealt with a breach and what worked and what didn't.
Well, I think we learned a lot about what that communication looked like as a business. And I think you've touched on an important point, which is it's still a bit of a sensitive topic. People don't want to talk about it maybe too much. They don't want to discuss it. But actually, that openness amongst the good guys is what allows everybody to learn and understand, right? What does good look like? What did you learn along that way? What happened to you? And it's really important. And I guess tentatively, Hitachi Vantara did share and was very transparent in the communications. And I wouldn't say a surprise, but were happy that that approach paid huge dividends. There was an enormous level of respect for that openness. Uh, Trust was built up enormously in being so open and transparent with our customers and our suppliers. And working together, we now have much higher degree of proximity to those organizations because we did that. And we still have sessions and workshops today with a wide variety of organizations, giving them a view about what happened to us. This is not, a dark, dirty secret. This is something that we need to share and learn together. And it is difficult to do because people just want to hide away sometimes, I think, and just go, well, it never happened to us. But the truth of the matter is it does.
I mean, I think that the flag to raise here for anyone listening or watching is that it's quite common for studies to report that only 1 in 9 ransomware attacks is ever made public. And when you're trying to assess risk, whether you're an underwriter or just a business, It's really hard to do when you don't have intelligence about the threat. And that is the most obvious intelligence there is. How often does this happen? Well, if you're only hearing about, 10 or 12% of the incidents, you're going to maybe have a slightly positive outlook that isn't deserved. Uh, you touched on the JLR, the Jaguar Land Rover hack, and the one of the things that I believe, this is my opinion, we have come to this moment in the tech information age revolution where we've enjoyed all of this frequency reduction, excuse me, friction reduction. And, it's as simple as being able to email something and not mail it. And we went from mail to fax to email. And, now we're complaining about email because we get spam so much. But there are so many other ways, even the paying of bills, mailing checks. You can wire money now. These seem like they've been around forever, and they are relatively new things. Even doing things on a personal level, like, sitting on the train and maybe paying your bills on your bank app. These are things that happen. But these reductions in friction have come at a cost. And the phrase you use, the just-in-time supply chain, which obviously means that you're not warehousing things, you're not paying that extra cost to store things somewhere because you're not quite ready for them yet, or you're worried about them not being delivered on time. This great efficiency means that there's not a lot of redundancy. And I wonder whether you could sort of parse out and, if you will, double click on the JLR reality, and how that isn't just a JLR reality. This is a reality across business, whether you're dealing with physical supplies or even just data moving through, if you will, the internet. Um, uh, Tell me a little more about that landscape and that reality that really also touches on the idea that you mentioned. It's not if, but when for this sort of thing for companies, and it's because we share a common vulnerability.
Yeah, there's a couple of things here, but I did reference JLR, and I think that's it's a physical component example of just in time, right? So those components by the conveyor belt, it's highly efficient, and then it effectively almost doesn't touch the shelves, right? As it's then deployed within the vehicles and then off of the conveyor belt or the production line. And my point there was that, with the JLR impact, then there were a whole stack of supply chain organizations, many of which were SMBs in the UK, that were hugely affected and didn't have the deep pockets of someone like a JLR to be able to tolerate that type of impact from that incident. So I think there's such a wide um, economic impact beyond just that one company. These incidents now, especially with the larger organizations, are much wider. And there were many stories of supply chain organizations that were impacted in that. I think when you start looking at, from a digital perspective, um, we're seeing suppliers, whatever that may be, whether that's physical or digital of some way, shape, or form, that we see bad actors attacking the supply chain to get into the main organization. So there are a whole stack of issues there about making sure that your supply chain, and we're seeing this an awful lot more over the last few years, how secure, how protected, how quick are they to recover in your supply chain, identify issues that have occurred beyond just the main single organization that they're supplying to. So there's a whole wider ripple effect around um, these challenges that organizations have that they need to make sure they're constantly adapting to.
In the insurance context, when you look at that supply chain liability, I suppose, what's your experience with where policies have lines that maybe people didn't realize were there beforehand, or they hadn't been talked through a policy that extended through the entire supply chain to protect them against the liability, and also to give them the ability to claw back money in a case of a breach? What kind of boundaries are there for that?
Yeah, I think that's like any insurance policy. Number one, make sure you understand it in detail and where your coverage is and where it isn't. There are challenges here where who is liable? If it's the breach is from a supplier, then is the supplier liable? Are you chasing down a supplier for that? Is it the insurance company that's then going to be looking at compensation from them? That's a challenge. And if the issue then extends beyond the remit of your policy, then suddenly you're left exposed. How far can you go? I use that. There was a film many years ago called Deep Impact, right? And then it was about the president having an affair with a woman called Ellie, which wasn't the case at all. There was an asteroid heading towards Earth, and it was going to destroy Earth. And Ellie is an extinction level event, right? And actually, I think it's Deloitte have been talking about this for many years. And we are at that stage. This happens. This is not something, we're going to get to the stage where organizations are going to stop trading. This is happening. I agree, but they're a lot smaller than some of the organizations we referenced. And maybe that will take it where one of these large names will end up going out of business. An extinction level event where the incident is so severe, has such paralysis on that organization that they're out. How does an insurance company cover that? Is it the liability then from a cyber perspective where an organization no longer functions? So policies can go so far. I certainly see an awful lot of the insurance area providing very valuable insights from an assessment point of view. How risky are you as an organization? What specialisms do they have? What methodologies do they follow? Because we all understand, forgive me, some of the very basic accreditations on cybersecurity, ticking the boxes, I'm not going to reference any names, are very basic, right? They give a level of security. They give maybe some kind of security that you feel okay, but they're not genuinely probably fit for purpose at that stage. So my advice would be genuinely to lean on those insurance organizations. It should feel more like a partnership, that they're working with you, and it's not a arm's length policy with someone, in dark clothing standing behind a piece of paper. It shouldn't be that way. And I think under that basis, you can only get very good advice about options and how you can strengthen your posture, and I'll go all the way back to, it's how you recover, right? Accept you can be very defensive. It will reduce your probability, but it's going to happen, right? So you just extend the time it takes. It's how you can recover, how quickly you can recover and get your business back up and running in that minimum viable business that we've already discussed.
So when you talk about recovery, one of the things that happens in a breach is typically your data goes unusable, right? You lose access to your data. And the phrase you used, which I love, was data is the new oil. And if you could imagine as a company that you start a Monday morning and you don't have access to anything, like overnight, your organization has lost all its data or has had it encrypted. And I wonder whether companies, you touched on this, don't quite appreciate the phrase that I've heard used and you use is data sprawl. This idea that they've got it's it used to be you had to keep paper copies of things. In the U.S., it was IRS tax records for 7 years as an individual in boxes on paper, and now it's easier to keep things because the storage has gotten so much cheaper. And I wonder whether or not you could talk about like the exposure that exists in that respect and the way that complicates recovery.
Yeah, goodness me, there's a lot. And although it's quite topical at the moment, the Strait of Hormuz is still blockaded, or however you were to perceive it. But I look at that and say, oil. If you don't have oil, then economies, slowly grind to a halt. If you don't have data, everything stops immediately, right? Everything stops, right? Because there is no information. So, data is the new oil. I think when it comes to data sprawl, this is important, right? Generally, the most important applications, your minimum viable business, there is a level of centralization, and you need to make sure that's covered and it's backed up. But there is so much data. The data created this year is more than all of the years ever put together, right? There's more data created in the next 12 months than there ever has been, all cumulatively put together, which is crazy. But those are the stats, and next year will be the same. So, a lot of people talk about, I don't know whether they can remember this, use the backup things to tape. That still happens. But the challenge here is, because data's got so big, how quick can you load all of that information back where it's clean to get your business, your minimum viable business up and running? At Hitachi, it's about flash and speed of recovery. We work with the likes of Commvault, so we have a fully integrated solution that allows us to recover quickly. And that centralized approach, identifying those critical applications that allow you to continue your business under a minimum state, right? As you bring systems back online, but you need to be able to recover very quickly to those key applications. We are in a global environment now, but at the same time, there is data sprawl and there are solutions that will understand in an automated fashion critical information and bring that together for you so you can recover. And that's where then your policies, your processes come into place that say, right, this works here technically. What processes are we now deploying in these situations? And one of the things that we did discuss around this when we talk about data sprawl and if you're bringing it together is when you recover, are you training? You know, you don't suddenly walk on, forgive me for the sports analogy, but you don't suddenly walk on a football pitch and be the best football player in the world. It just doesn't work that way. It's many thousands of hours of training and continuous training. You know, the best footballers in the world, best sports people in the world, they train all the time. And so you have to be in an environment that says, are we training ourselves to be able to do this correctly? When did we last train? Who was here? Have we tested these processes? And you need to continually do that. So you need to have technology in place that allows you to do that. It's not about walking around pulling plugs out of things or deploying, shutting systems down. You can spin up these environments to allow your teams to train and you can report back and then you can start getting better at what you're doing. That also gives board level confidence to say, if these things happen, our teams are trained to be able to bring us back. And they will be able to bring us back in these timelines. We're confident we have the coverage to be able to do it. I think just sitting there and saying, well, let's hope we don't get hit and we're protected and we've got some backup somewhere, it's just not going to get you through. And that's where we've seen some of the impacts.
Yeah, I mean, that's sound advice that you hear from everyone who knows what they're talking about is you practice like you play, and if you don't practice, you don't play. These are not, again, the sports analogies aside, but it's no different than anything else. If you're a pianist or if you're a singer or an actor, you have to, and some of that training is mundane. An aside, I went on tour with a big rock band once, and I was amazed that the lead singer was doing vocal coach work for an hour before each concert, just to warm his voice up and to keep it fresh. And he was singing 5 nights a week, and I didn't even think about it being a physical strain on his neck. And he ate and drank to prepare himself, and it was just one of those moments where you realize that idea of preparation leads to performance, and that is a ubiquitous piece of advice. So it's very important that you take that on board. It's also amazing how hard it is to do for people sometimes to take that time and to train and not just make it some sort of PowerPoint that you check a box on. And so, yeah, they trained, but they didn't really learn anything. They're not really prepared. So that, I think that's sound advice. You gave me a castle and moat metaphor when we spoke.
Yes.
I wonder if you could take me through that, because as anyone who's seen my podcast knows, I like people to explain things to me like I'm a fifth grader, to put it in the American school context. But I also think that helps because a lot of this is really important to people who maybe aren't technical. So take me through the castle and moat metaphor with regards
Yeah.
to it.
No, of course. So this is where you'll hear terms potentially like air gapping, etc. So in a world of everything's connected, when everything is connected, that means that the bad actors can get everywhere, right? Because everything is connected. And so under that basis, even if you have a backup environment, even if you have terms like multi-factor authentication, these bad actors will still gain entry into that data. And obviously it's then encrypted, and then they'll start this potentially in a ransomware environment. You'll then go, oh my goodness, go to the backups, they're all encrypted. So in very simple layman's terms, you build a castle for your most critical data. And that's where you store the clean copies of that data, right? In that castle, and you build a moat around it. It's not connected, right? It's not on your network. It's in a very clean environment, isolated from the rest of your network where no one can get there. And then in a very, this is very simplified, you would lower the drawbridge, load your new data, and lift the drawbridge up again. It cannot be attacked. You cannot be in an environment. And the only things that pass into that environment are clean, right? So all of those things, you'll hear of things like clean rooms, etc. So you shall not pass the drawbridge unless you've been truly inspected and you're allowed in, right? And I think having environments like that, we have to be smarter, right? You can't adapt to everything. As an example, this was back in, I think it's 2017, 2018. You talked about an adaptive environment. There was some of the people watching this may even recall this potentially, an American casino that was breached through its smart fish tank. Sometimes you just can't anticipate what's going to go on. All devices, light bulbs, all sorts of different devices are now completely connected. Secured physical doors, they're all connected. There's access points, and your attack surface is so wide now, it's really difficult. So having an environment that says, well, data can get bigger, can be more complex, our systems can have sprawl, but our minimum viable business lives in a castle, right? With a moat around it, and we know we're safe. The team can access that castle when an incident occurs, and we can now know that those systems can exit the castle, and we can deploy our business, and we can recover from a horrible situation, but we can recover from it, and we can continue operating as an organization. So yeah, there's a whole stack of things to take into account. And you're right, being adaptive, because especially in the development of AI, which on a 1-year development cycle is crazy. So who knows where that's going to be in 24 months, 36 months time. You just never quite know. It's always developing and growing. So having an environment where the basics work well, and the castle and the moat does work well, very well, then I think that's sound advice for any organization, just making sure they're prepared.
So preparation starts at the top. And we've touched on communication and leadership and phrases like adaptive change. I wonder whether you might take me into the sort of C-suite and the board level conversation that needs to be occurring. If a board member or a CEO or a CFO is listening to this, or any member of the C-suite, what kind of things that should they be asking the CISO, the Chief Information Security Officer, about? That's sort of a new role at a lot of C-suites, and sometimes they don't report directly into the C-suite. They report to the CFO, so they're slightly outside the core decision-making group. The board maybe meets quarterly and has time demands, and they only get 30 minutes a quarter. What types of things should be on the agenda, top of the list for a conversation with the CISO if you're at a board or C-suite level now?
Yeah, and this is a big topic, right? Because some things will generate profit, and some things will stop you from no longer making profit, right? So, and it's one of those that stops you. You'll be in a position where there won't be any profit to kind of worry about, because your business no longer is functioning properly. So I think there's a couple of things. A CEO is a board level topic. We've seen it on the IT agenda items for at least the last 5 years, that cybersecurity is in the top 3 of board level discussions. I think predominantly we've moved beyond your basic certification to say we're fine, we've got the tick box, right, and everything's okay. I think there's a few things. Everybody seated around that board needs to take cybersecurity seriously. The number one entry point for bad actors is your end users. Over 90% is to do with end user, some kind of end user integration. Phishing attacks are well over 90%, right? And when it comes to entry points. So everyone around that room making sure that all employees are taking it seriously from a protection point of view, but recovery is critical. So the number one, the CEO has to take cybersecurity as a top priority. It's something that can stop you from trading, in the same way that you're a financial services institute and you need to be compliant to FCA regulations or SEC regulations. Cybersecurity needs to be there too, right? So number one, CEO takes it seriously. CISO, the CEO needs to hold the CISO to account, right? And the CISO needs to hold the business to account. There is always a trade-off, because you can just keep spending, right, on security, and you need to make sure that there is a balance, right? There is not a bottomless pit of money, but the CISO also needs to demonstrate the value of recovery. So protection with an acceptable level of risk. No risk is acceptable. Well, I'm afraid in cyber, you have to accept some. And recovery has to be the demonstration of your minimum viable business with a demonstrable record of how quickly it takes you to recover and what impact that is to your business. So if your recovery window is 3 weeks, is that acceptable to your board? And if not, what does it require ongoing as investment to make sure that recovery window is no, by the way, no recovery window is ever acceptable, right? Less than 10 seconds. But realistically, when you hit these types of incidents, what can the business just about absorb to be able to carry on? And that's an honest debate around the board to make sure that the investment balance is there with regards to the acceptable window for recovery. And then that kind of defines your investment profile. So it's never about whether you have the ability to recover your minimum viable business. It's generally the speed of which you can recover that business, because the lowering of the investment generally means the elongation of the window that it takes to recover your organization, even under a minimum viable business scenario. So it's a board level topic and it has the ability to close you down. And as I suggested, you need to have it as the same level of FCA or SEC type regulations, because if you're not taking it seriously, it's going to very quickly come back and bite you. And you may well have an event like Ellie, right? That's the simplest.
You contextualized this when we spoke in planning this, that it needs to rise to the level of health and safety
Yes.
standard. And health and safety for my American audience is like OSHA. This is, high vis vests and hard hats on a construction site, and then a myriad of other rules and regulations that are designed to keep the employees safe, largely for their safety and physical protection. But the wise part of that for a business is that then they're safe to continue working and making money, as in not interrupting business. And that the health and safety reality and the OSHA standards that exist need to that mentality about why they matter, and adherence to them. This issue of cyber needs to rise to that sort of level, and that's a way to equate it to something that already exists. And you see, okay, we have to spend a lot of money on that stuff, but A, it's required, and B, it's actually quite wise, or A, it's wise, and B, it's also required, however they might look at it. Is that a sort of way to think about it for a company that maybe is, not cyber, but everyone's cyber and digital now?
Yeah, and it's interesting because the health and safety example that I use with you, the reason I use that was that it's relevant to almost all size organizations, if not all actually, which is that there is a sense of responsibility to someone's well-being. And everybody has a level of ownership, right? If you see someone that's not being safe, you need to flag it to them. You need to keep everyone in account, and you're accountable in turn for their safety. And the reason I spoke about cybersecurity is if we don't have that same level of focus and attention, then okay, it's not personal injury per se, but there's lots of people that could be out of a job, right? And that level of impact arguably could be just as bad, if not worse, to those individuals, right? So I think health and safety is something that's a non-negotiable. It's not about fines, it's about lives. And so it's taken that seriously. Cybersecurity has to be considered in that light. However, it's not a bottomless pit of investment, right? And so this is why you have insurance to ensure that, forgive that, you have insurance to make sure that you've got that coverage in place, that to fall back on, right? And you've got those experts that will immediately step up. It's part of your business continuity planning. It has to be taken seriously. I think most of the market now has moved into a position where they are taking it seriously. I still think there's elements of it won't happen to me. We still have very basic issues among our user base, you know, password management, multi-factor authentication is only deployed in about a quarter of organizations even today. These are very basic tools that people need to be leaning on just to that first defense protection, right? And making sure they're in a position to be able to move forward. So sometimes the investment profile doesn't allow you to do those things, and that means it's not really being taken seriously. It is a matter of priorities inside the business. Any CEO or all of those members around the board will have a set of priorities they want to spend on. You just can't compromise on cybersecurity and recovery, right? Because it's the reason why your business actually runs. And unless you've got that investment and the recovery elements there, your business is not going to exist, right? So you must be taking it seriously.
we've touched quite a bit on incident response planning and the sort of fundamental things that get overlooked. In the UK, the Cyber Resilience Act, one of the tenets in it is that you have a physical copy of your incident response plan. And I think I mentioned to you when we spoke
Yes.
that I'd been told about a lumber company that spent 2 weeks trying to begin their incident response plan, but they didn't have they didn't have all their phone numbers in a physical form, right? So I wonder whether there are other sort of fundamentals in that space that get overlooked. And the Cyber Resilience Act, it strikes me as pretty forward tilting in this space. I wonder what you have any more thoughts about those basic things that exist in planning for failure, because you know it's going to happen, and almost that sort of mindset that any complex plan has in a complex environment. The environment and the future and any adversary you might have, they have their own plans, which is going to make your plan obsolete the minute you start to employ it. Right? There's going to be things that change your plan, and it'll rain on your wedding day comes to mind. What else might you have to say about that?
Yeah, look, I think it's an interesting one that is often overlooked. If you don't have a hard copy of people's telephone numbers, you're not going to be able to look them up, right? Because you can't get access to the data. It doesn't exist. It's not there. So it's very basic things like that that allow you to move forward. For me, it's critical individuals. The basics, and I'll say this because, and this should strike a chord with most, it's keeping it up to date, right? You will tend to find there, unfortunately, it goes in waves. You'll have initiatives inside of organizations. We're all about cybersecurity. We need to make the investment. We need to get these things done. It's business continuity planning. We need to make sure we're covered on this. It's big wave, big initiative, perfectly done. Everything is amazing. And then it troughs. The attention moves to something else. The spotlight moves elsewhere, and nothing's kept up to date. And people move on. They change. Systems change. Priorities potentially change. Your organization becomes international when it was once national. The systems are now hybrid, cross between a number of hyperscalers. So your data becomes disparate. Therefore your process planning, your recovery planning will change. The telephone numbers on those pieces of paper, laminated, I'm sure, right, will also need to change. And yet it's not a one-time only thing. Part of your process and your basics need to be, okay, each month, let's just double check everything's as it should be. Are these people still employed? Are these their telephone numbers? Have any of our applications changed? That can be done very quickly. In this world of, workflow automation, those checks can be done, right? In a matter of minutes, but they need to be done. Those workflows need to be employed to make sure that there is a cross check against all of that. Are those plans correct and up to date? Yes. Right. In that case, fine. We don't need to reprint everything. Right. Actually, there are some changes. We need to get the hard copies done and we need to get them printed out. So it's super basic things like that. Well, I'm talking to you and you would say, well, of course we do that. But actually, I would say common sense tells you know that those waves of initiatives inside an organization move on. And then there is an assumption that somebody, not that anybody's been allocated the responsibility, somebody will keep them up to date. And it just doesn't happen. And then the whole thing folds and falls to bits in 9 months' time, 2 years' time, when suddenly you realize, oh goodness, everything's changed. We've had an incident. And now actually 3/4 of this data, this information that we printed off isn't worth it. And that's when you get into these situations where people think they're prepared and they're not. Because they had an initiative 18 months ago, but nothing's kept up to date. So I would probably pull that out as the most basic thing that needs to be that's obvious, that isn't that obvious when you're in the corporate world and there are waves of focus over here and people are time poor.
Yeah, I mean, I think you make a good point. What keeps you secure is perishable. Plans are perishable. Information is perishable. What's true today may not be true tomorrow, and that's just a function that time changes things. And it is one of those easy things to look at. And you make a really, really good point. And the analogy I've used is that, cybersecurity in this side of the business is almost like being good at retreating. If you're a general, nobody gets promoted for being good at retreating. You get promoted for being good at attacking. And if you equate attacking to revenue creation and defending to what protection of things or spending, I suppose. It is that idea that you need to do very simple things, and there needs to be a routine to it. For me, this is one of those examples where I can't imagine there isn't, and you touched on it, some sort of AI integration where it can create a moment where once a month or however frequently you think you need to do it. Maybe it's something you should check your cyber insurance policy and make sure you're doing as frequently as you're supposed to stay insured. That idea that it goes away is really um, it's important. I mean, something as simple as phone numbers, being able to call people. Do you have everyone on that list you need? Do you have legal counsel? Do you have an outside consulting firm that's engaged in PR on the B2B level and then the to consumer level as well? There are a lot of boxes to check, and then make sure you can keep them checked over time. You touched on, and I wonder whether you could just explain this for maybe a non-technical executive, immutable backups and clean rooms a little bit ago. I wonder if you could tell me, for someone who maybe doesn't really know what that means, but nods their head knowingly when they hear those words, what that means to someone who is only capable of the plain English.
Yes. So we'll start with immutable backups. So, yeah, and you'll hear a lot about immutable backups, or sometimes they are known as worm. You'll hear the term worm, right? Worm is write once, read many. And what basically means is you write the data once, and from there on in, it can't be changed. You can read it lots, but you can only ever write it once. And immutable backups are effectively the same thing, right? Those backups are written once and cannot be changed. Access to them can be changed, but the backups themselves cannot be changed. The backups themselves cannot be changed at all. So I think when people say, well, I've got immutable backups, you go, okay, I can freeze you out of the backups, right? So you can't get access to your backup environments. This is why I talk about a castle. You need to be in a position that says, right, if all of our data is clean, i.e., there is no bad actor or bad code or whatever it may be within that environment, that if I suddenly recover it, I've effectively recovered the ransomware all over again. If it's clean, then I can bring it back. And immutable backups allow you to say we're good, but that's not a singular solution, right? It has to be harnessed with, forgive me, my castle, right? You need to put it in an environment that itself you're not blocked to get access to, so you can retrieve those immutable backups. Those things become really important. And a clean room is ultimately, I'm going to think of a really terrible analogy at this point, Martin, but let's, if you're open, you don't know what's inside the box, right? Imagine backups like a box. It's full of all of your data. But you know that someone's infected all of these boxes, or all of these boxes to a certain point. Because when you get ransomware in your environment, every time you back up, you're backing up the ransomware, i.e. the badness is in that backup. So you need to go back to a point in time where your backups are clean. It wasn't in that environment. There's a couple of ways of doing this, but I'm going to take the basic one first. The clean room allows you to open the box and go, oh goodness, it's still there, and it doesn't get out. Okay. You effectively can close the box. I don't want it anymore. Because once you've opened it, then it starts to spread all over again. So that's your clean environment. It's your environment say, right, what have I got? Until you get to the point where you go, okay, this is good. Now you can take that into your true environment. So this environment is called clean. It's almost if you were in a medical facility, right? It's one of those rooms that says, okay, well, the virus doesn't go out beyond this environment. And so that's what it allows you to do. Sometimes, depending on how long something's been in your environment, or how far it's penetrated, you can get that box, open it, and you can actually try and clean your backup, right? How can you unpick what's there, what's infected? There's possibility of doing that. And then what you're left with is okay. And then you can put it into your environment. That's rare, especially if you're in a pickle, you might need to do that. But those clean rooms, the immutability, all of those are part of, to be honest, a fairly standard recovery process. And I think everybody in an organization at board level should be just intrigued, be inquisitive about what capability your organization has within your recovery. Spend a half a day, get someone to talk you through it in very basic terms. What have we got? How does it work? What does it look like? And the laws of physics still apply, right? Just because it's technology speak, right? Common sense is still absolutely appropriate. And so never worry about some of the language that you use that you may feel is fairly basic terminology. I always say if someone can't explain it to you in very simple form, then they probably don't understand it that well themselves, right? So suddenly you're getting confused by terminology. It's quite all right to, exactly as you did earlier, I'm in fifth grade, explain it to me simply. And if they can't do that, then they don't understand it. And you've got a whole problem in itself with the staff you have. So I wouldn't be too worried about the terminology. I would just ensure that you understand and it makes sense to you. Never be in a situation, even at board level, it doesn't matter whether you're HR, the CEO, or whatever role you have. If you don't understand it basically and say, well, what happens? What happens? What happens? Okay, I get it. And until you understand it, you need to understand it as well, because business incidents and continuity planning affect everybody sat around the board. So you probably need to understand it, at least what's happening, where are we up to? So whether you're communicating with your staff, your suppliers, your customers, you can do it in a way that everybody else understands. So take that time and understand it. And I'm glad you asked me that question about, things like immutability, clean rooms. I explained about things like worm. Everyone loves an abbreviation in IT, and it sometimes is really not required. Sorry, I'm completely digressing, but there was one thing where someone said to me, "Oh, we've got some TOR switches." Now, anyone in generally most people in IT will go, they'll know what that is. Now, to a man or a woman on the street, they'll go, "TOR switches, what is that?" TOR, like what does that mean? Like, is there some complex terminology? Well, when you're in a data center, you have racks, right? And the switches, guess what? They're top of rack. So it just means that a switch is at the top of the rack. Why don't we just say the switch at the top of the rack? Okay, great. But no, we all sometimes I think it's just a language maybe just to alienate everybody else. It's like a secret code. There really is no need sometimes.
But the cynical journalist in me thinks that you can probably charge more when you train people in acronyms, but maybe I'm.
Maybe true.
I just want to wrap up, because one of the things that I
Yes.
really enjoyed about preparing for this was that it's yet, and I have them quite frequently, to be fair, a reminder of how little I know. And Hitachi Vantara is a massive organization. Is it 200,000 employees and 70 billion in revenue? I wonder if you could tell me a little more about this enormous global technology company that I guess I should know more about.
Yes. Look, we're really good at not making a lot of noise, right? Hitachi Group. So Hitachi Vantara is part of that group. Hitachi Group is, it's in excess of $70 billion, well over 200,000 employees worldwide. And it's a digital organization, right? A lot of people who maybe are as old as me remember Hitachi for all sorts of different consumer electronics, amongst other things. Hitachi has really looked to focus on social infrastructure, digital enablement, and really driving technology where IT meets OT, right? And I give you an example of that. So things like Hitachi Rail. We have AI stack solutions that are deployed from a rail operator's perspective. We've got those also in providing it to various organizations worldwide, from airlines. Also, renewable energy, huge focus on sustainability. Hitachi Vantara are the only storage company to provide Energy Star certified and rated products to market. So we deliver the highest level of storage per watt used than anybody else in the industry. So there's a huge focus, Japanese production. So we are a Japanese organization, whereas in this economic climate or political climate, that's a pretty positive thing for some these days, right? So really powering ahead with sustainability, Japanese high-end production. Hitachi is used in some of the most critical digital infrastructure in the world. Bulletproof is what people always term it. Right now, it's we're a sleeping giant in a lot of senses, although we're a $70 billion organization. And Hitachi Vantara is a sleeping giant. Have, of course, I would say so, but some of the most innovative market leading products in the environment. We just don't tell enough people about it. So we are a behemoth with agility and innovation at our core. with always associated and underpinned by sustainability, really pushing out into the market. So I'm glad you asked me. It's one of the reasons that I'm talking to a host of different organizations, really to allow them to understand there is a choice. You can choose different, and you will be very pleased and surprised. It's just, we provide the dial tone to IT. People just don't realize who provides the dial tone, and that's us.
So we've been talking about an hour, and as promised, I wonder whether there's anything we didn't touch on or we didn't get to that we discussed prior to the recording that you'd want to say something about.
Um, I think, look, we've covered an awful lot. I think something that's really important to me, which is maybe off topic a little, is coaching others. I'm a big fan of paying it forward, right? So I think anybody that is listening to this, that if you've got experience, you've got skills and capabilities, I think it's really important to think about how you pay it forward to others. Um, and I think not only are you helping somebody else, which is a decent human being thing to do, I think it helps that feeds your soul as well, right? So it's a good thing to do. Those early in career, those others that need help, I think it's really important. No matter what industry you're in, I think sometimes, whether you're in cyber insurance, IT, sometimes you can go, what good am I doing in the world, right? And society? Well, you can help others. That's your gift. And I think it's good for the soul. And I think in this world of self-serving, often driven by social media and various norms in society, I think the ability to be kind has been lost sometimes. So my final words would only be about just be kind to others. It's not only is it the right thing to do, it's also good for you too. So those will be my final items to cover, Martin.
Well, I will say on behalf of Cyber Insurance News, here. I completely concur, and I'm a professional in a business that's built on mentoring and that sort of thing, and I've enjoyed them myself, and I hope I've been able to be be one in some way for others as well. So one last question: you're in London, you're in the United Kingdom. Uh, for UK business leaders listening and watching, what's the one big thing they should take away? If they only remember one thing from this conversation, what should it be?
Uh, I- if you haven't asked your CISO inside the last 4 weeks how long it takes you to recover, I suggest you go and ask them that question. Be inquisitive, in all seriousness, be inquisitive, ensure you understand, and you have to understand what your minimum viable business is. That would be it.
Lee, anything else?
Not from me. Thank you so
Great.
much.
Well, Lee Nolan, General Manager of UK Ireland for Hitachi Vantara, thank you so much for the time. Everyone else, appreciate it. We've referenced a few things here. There'll be links down in the show notes, as well as links to Lee and Hitachi Vantara, so you can find them and follow up. If you got a question or a comment, please, wherever you might be listening or watching this, leave it in the comments, and we'll get an answer to you, or I'll pass it on to Lee and see what we can find out. And that's it from us for today. I'm Martin Hinton, the Executive Editor of Cyber Insurance News and Information. Thanks for watching. Enjoy the rest of your day.